So we just had Jay Chen, who was touching the topic of degrowth economic and different economic models a little bit. Our next speaker for today, I'm super excited, is Professor Julia Steinberger from the University of Lausanne. She's working on social economics and ecological economics. I think we're going to hear more about degrowth right now, and I actually don't want to spend too much time on the introduction. Julia, the floor is yours. Thanks a lot for being with us.
Thank you so much. So I want to tell you a bit about my research, and I'm mainly interested in the discussion. So please let me know when the time is up. I don't have your window right now, so just let me know when I'm around 25 minutes. That would be great. So I want to tell you a bit about my research in the context of the Living Well Within Limits project. And what that means for research and for action. So hopefully what that will have some resonance with you in terms of what you're trying to think about and your current activities. So obviously we have a climate context where we're already well within the climate crisis. This is a picture that was taken close to where I live in Vesubie in France, which is in the Vesubie is a small town in the Alps close by, and they were completely devastated by a flood last fall. But as you know, climate impacts are all around us and in Belgium as well. And the problem, obviously, is that basically the problem is very simple. We're doing this, where this is increasing the temperature of our planet outside a safe range. And the range is very important here. So one of the things that's really important to understand about our society, our civilization, our communities, is that we depend on stability. And one of the things that our planet had for the past 12,000 years was it had a very nice stability of temperature. And that stable temperature and time is called the Holocene. And you can see here, this is a graph with the temperature range of the Holocene. 0 degrees corresponds to the pre-industrial era, the temperature around 1750 before we started burning a lot of fossil fuels in the Industrial Revolution. And you can see that we've now moved well out of the Holocene temperature range, and we're moving very fast. We're moving at about half a degree per decade at this point. So just an absolute acceleration in the Earth system, well outside the range in which our species developed agriculture and cities and civilization and writing and all of those things. So we're really in a very dangerous situation. And the fact that we're doing this very dangerous thing and doing it so fast means that our emissions need to do this. They need to basically fall off a cliff, which is something that that we're not currently doing, right? We're still accelerating our emissions. Now, one question we can have is that if we're in such a dangerous situation, on such a dangerous trajectory, who could possibly have known this future that we are in? And this is a graph that you might have already seen, but it was developed in 1980, around in the early 1980s. It was published in 1982. And so here you see the years on the horizontal axis. And this is roughly where 1980 is. I hope you can see my little mouse, sort of at the beginning of the graph. On the left-hand side of the graph, there's carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. On the right-hand side, there's temperature. And you can see that whoever developed this graph knew very well that increasing carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere would also increase the temperature of the planet. And their predictions were very close in terms of our trajectory in terms of carbon dioxide. They were a little bit on the high side, and the temperature, they were a little bit, quite a bit on the low side, unfortunately. And the people responsible for this plot were scientists working for Exxon, now ExxonMobil, one of the largest petrochemical companies in the world, right? So oil, gas, et cetera, companies in the world. And so one of the things that we really need to understand and grapple with is that we are currently in a future that the fossil fuel industry threw us into, knowing very well what would happen. So they threw us into this future deliberately, and that has to have consequences in terms of how we think and change what we are currently doing. So in terms of my research, the implications are quite clear. We need urgent and large-scale action, radical emission reductions, getting to zero or very close within the next 20 years. And the fastest and surest way to do that is to reduce consumption. Now, reducing consumption doesn't require as much new technology or infrastructure as trying to maintain the same level of consumption with different technologies. So if we want to act fast, the safest way to do it, the fastest way to do it, is to reduce consumption. But we need to know how to do this, how to reduce consumption while preserving or enhancing well-being. And I guess that's my view of degrowth, is you reduce material consumption while preserving or enhancing well-being. And that's the real way to do climate mitigation, in my view, and also the view of, for instance, somebody like Kevin Anderson of Manchester. So to do this research, which is something that people hadn't really been thinking about at all at the scale necessary, we need a new research framework. And so this is the research framework of the Living Well Within Limits project that I lead, and we call it LWLI for short. It's that we have basically 3 different stages or 3 different things we need to take into account. And obviously we're cutting across disciplines, scales, etc. It's very all-encompassing, but we try to study it, and I think we can find reasonable things. We look at biophysical inputs into our societies. So we have planetary processes that need to be stable, obviously. We don't want to go beyond planetary boundaries. These link to natural resources and how we use them. On the other side, we have social outcomes. So on the left, we have social outcomes. We want to enhance well-being. And in order to do that, we need to satisfy human needs. So far, that seems pretty clear. And in the middle, we have this idea of provisioning systems, which are integrated physical and social systems. I'm not going to have a huge amount of time to talk about them today, just a bit, but I think that that's something that we really need to think about, is to think about our economies and societies in terms of provisioning systems that have both physical and social aspects to them. Now, well-being is a funny thing to research. So one of the things we needed to do was to read about that, learn about it, understand how we could grapple with it. And so I'm just going to tell you a little bit about well-being, because I think it's important to learn how to think about it in different ways. And I'm going to tell you about it in a cartoon format, because some of the first people and some of the most interesting people to research well-being came from ancient Greece. So around 350 BC, there was Aristotle, and in a snapshot, he said that well-being, in his view, meant to be able to live life as fully as possible and to flourish within society. And that might seem very reasonable, but that is not the dominant view today. The dominant view today follows somebody who came along a bit later, Epicure, who said that well-being means to achieve the most positive and the least negative feelings possible. And that is a view that you might recognize, and a bit more familiar. And it's a conflict, or this difference in views actually persists to this day. So like all good academic disputes, they keep the fight going. So you have to choose a team. And if you're on Team Epicure, you might see well-being. Wait, I'm sorry, my voice is just too scratchy. I'm going to go get my teacup. You might see well-being as happiness. It's an individual perspective. You might recognize the utility indicator in economics as relevant to well-being growth, which allows you to have more income, which means you have more consumption, which means you have more positive feelings, might be the way that you recognize well-being. So it's a view where growth, you justify growth and well-being going together in this worldview. However, if you're on Team Aristotle, your worldview is very different. And you might see well-being more as flourishing. It's much more social rather than individual as a perspective. You might measure it through a multidimensional indicator set, like the Human Development Index or the Sustainable Development Goals. And you're really trying to your view of the economy is much more around development. So your view of what the society should be doing or what the economy should be doing is it should be supporting human potential. So it's not just about growth at all. And I would say that we read about this and we decided that we were new recruits of Team Aristotle, and we wrote some papers about this. If you're interested, they're open access and hopefully interesting to you. Now, one of the things that's interesting is we're working with quantitative data. Can we test Aristotle's theory? And Aristotle's theory, which is sort of his perspective on well-being, was sort of translated into more modern terms in the Theory of Human Need of Doyle and Guff in 1991. which is this idea that well-being is underpinned by a number of multidimensional, non-substitutable, satiable, which means that you can satisfy human needs. At some point, there is such a thing as enough. And then you can have well-being if all of these different human needs are satisfied. And that's something that we could try to test. So what we're doing here is we're trying to look for empirical evidence that multidimensional need satisfaction is a precondition for well-being. And this is something we did in 2018. If you want to look for it as a publication, it's in the supplementary information. So what we're doing is we're looking at a subjective well-being indicator, average life satisfaction. So that is definitely associated with anybody, even Epicure would recognize that as a well-being indicator. And then we're looking at countries according to the number of need satisfiers they achieve. So if a country achieves, let's say, 4 need satisfiers, we put them in the 4 bucket. If they achieve 0, 0, if they achieve all 9 of the ones we could measure, we put them in the 9 bucket. And this is the result we get. So we sort of can see that indeed subjective overarching well-being is very much a function of need satisfaction. The more needs you satisfy, the better off you are. And that means that we would say that this is good empirical evidence. We did the same for average life expectancy. So that's a physical health indicator of overarching well-being. And you can see that the relationship is, if anything, even stronger. And you also see a saturation phenomenon. So after a certain point, people are okay in terms of their physical health, which is good news. So we believe that we have evidence for the way we're trying to measure well-being. So the next thing we tried to do is we tried to see, does well-being within limits exist internationally? And we used the donut framework of Kate Raworth to test this. So Kate Raworth, if you haven't read Donut Economics, I really think that it's a really important book. There was a lot of food for thought for everybody in there, including for designers and people in the business, in private business and so on. But her basic idea is that we should be aiming to design our economies and our systems to aim for the safe and just space for humanity. Safe because it's within environmental ceilings and planetary boundaries and the outside, and just because it reaches social foundations on the inside. So you're not falling short in terms of your social aspects and you're within planetary boundaries. And we looked for, we tested this donut for internationally, and we found that no country currently exists within the donut. So everybody's falling short in one way or another. But we also understood that one of the things that would be very important to understand this is not just to look at a national level, but at a subnational level. So macro social factors, including distribution, are very important. And this is a picture showing really stark housing inequality in India. And I forget which city, I'm sorry. But anyway, so what we did is we measured inequality both internationally between countries and intranationally within income groups within countries. And we looked at it across consumption categories as well. And this was our article published in 2020. And the BBC translated it as climate change. The rich are to blame, which is true, but also kind of a shortcut of our study. So what we do is we're measuring direct and indirect energy footprints, which take trade into account, using this method called environmentally extended input-output across different categories of products in 86 countries, which are divided into income classes. And it allows us to do something like this, where we split the energy footprint into total. We can see the total energy footprint distribution, but also different categories, which are shown by the different colors here. And these are Lorentz curves. If you've never seen them before, they basically allow you to map distribution and inequality of a certain type of resource, which is on the vertical axis, versus population, which is on the horizontal axis. And if everything were equal, you'd be on the diagonal line. The further away you are from the diagonal line, the more unequal your system is. And one of the things you can immediately see here is that energy use itself, average energy footprint, is unequal. That's the red curve. But some categories are much more unequal than others, and those are transport. We're talking about package holidays, which was a category that included lots of flying, vehicle fuel, which is purple, other transportation is orange. So you can see that transportation is much more unequal. And this is also something that we see when we map product categories. So I realize if you're sitting at the back of the room, this might be a bit hard to read. I just want you to understand that we're mapping product categories across quadrants. And at the top of this plot are the categories that are consumed more by rich people. In economics, we call them luxury goods. And at the bottom are categories consumed more by poor people. In economics, we call them basic goods. And we're splitting this into less energy per dollar spent, so less energy intensity on the right side, more energy per dollar spent on the left side. And what was super interesting to us, and the reason I'm showing this to you, is that in this luxury and high intensity plot, you can see categories associated with transportation. So vehicle purchase, package holiday, vehicle fuel, other kinds of transport. So rich people drive more, and they're driving us off effectively, and they're driving us off the climate cliff. Whereas poor people tend to use energy and heat and electricity and housing, basically in buildings. So one of the things that we thought is that this is a problem you do not grow your way out of, right? You have to tax and regulate it. Whereas the building problem, the fact that poor populations, everybody basically uses heat and electricity in buildings, means that we need public investment in efficiency and low carbon housing. So that was one conclusion. I just want to show you this plot that came out last year in the emissions gap report, which really shows very clearly the inequality in climate change. And I want you to focus on the pie chart, where you see the red and purple part are the emissions pie of the top 10% of emitters, and the top 10% emit roughly half of all greenhouse gas emissions, whereas the bottom part of the population, the bottom half, is green, and they emit less than 10% of climate changing emissions. So you really have this hugely stark inequality where half the population emits less than 10%, whereas 10% of the population emits half. So we have a very unequal system. Now, one of the things we then decided to do is look at how to get inside Kate Raworth's donut. So one of the way we decided to do this is to use our analytic framework to measure how much energy is associated with different kinds of need satisfiers. And we use math to do this, but don't be scared of the math. And then we decided, so we're looking at energy versus need satisfaction, but then we also decided to look at these provisioning system factors. So basically, how is distribution, how are different factors affecting this? And so we're looking at these provisioning system factors using an interaction term as well, which gives us a domain of validity across the study, which is quite interesting. And what it allows us to do is it allows us to basically have a quantitative estimation, a quantitative identification of which of these provisioning factors, in terms of like public service quality, public health expenditure, electricity access, etc., allow us to do better, so are beneficial in terms of achieving human needs at lower energy use, or are detrimental, so would cause your energy use to grow for any given life, for any human need satisfaction. And it's very interesting because across the board, we're able to identify positive provisioning factors, which are the ones that show up in green here, and negative ones. And I'll tell you which ones are positive. So the provisioning factors that are positive are public service quality, public health coverage, trade and transport infrastructure is very positive, electricity access is massively positive, access to clean fuels the same, urban population is also positive, income equality is also positive, and democratic quality is positive. Trade penetration and foreign direct investments are not at all significant, so we can't really see anything there. But two factors we could identify as extremely negative in red here: extractivism, so having an economy that's dependent on raw resources and extraction from the environment, and economic growth above a moderate level of income is also identified as quite negative. So hopefully that's interesting. And I'm looking at the time, so I think we're okay for time. And so that means, so hopefully we've learned something interesting here in terms of which factors in our societies can help us get to a point where we reach high well-being and low energy use. The other study we decided to do is to model low energy, what a low energy and high well-being future could look like. And to do this, we use the decent living energy framework of Professor Narasimha Rao of Yale University. So we're really using his research as a basis for this. And in his viewpoint, he connects these human needs to sufficient levels of energy services. And what we do in this global model is we're taking into account technology improvements. So we're using existing high performance technologies. We're basically saying everybody has an equal distribution, everybody has equal access to energy services as their circumstances require. So it's equal distribution based on people's circumstances, and we basically model lower demand levels. And this is published in a study that came out last fall in Global Environmental Change. So what the model looks like, and I realize again you're not going to be able to see everything, but it's just a schematic. It takes decent living standards. So we're basically looking at these human needs of nutrition, clothing, mobility, etc. And this we can model as personal consumption in different configurations. And that personal consumption will have direct energy requirements that we can model based on given appliances and their standards, and also embodied energy, so upstream energy requirements that we model through our understanding via input-output modeling of what those kinds of appliances and production require in terms of upstream consumption. There's private consumption, so the private sector, so offices, retail space, freight transport, and there's also the public sector is modeled through hospitals and schools and the buildings that they require. And we also model infrastructure for everything, so houses, transport networks, schools and hospitals, water supply and sanitation, ICT networks and data centers, power generation. So all of this feeds into the model. And it might be interesting for you to know what the basis of this model is. So in terms of energy services per person, and hopefully you can see this. And this generated a lot of debate. Some people say this is not sufficient or this is sufficient, but it's something that Narasimha Rao tried to, basically the point is, if you have these living conditions, you should not suffer harm. You should not suffer deprivation. You should not be physically or socially uncomfortable in terms of your material living standards. So the nutrition is modeled to be a sufficient level of nutrition per person, and that depends on demography. So in the model, we model demographic change, so different people have different food requirements. So we try to take that into account, mainly dependent on gender and age. Living space is heated or cooled to 20 degrees year round. So this is a very comfortable living space of 15 square meters per person. And it depends. So in rural areas, we gave people more space, in urban areas a bit less space. And this depends on climate, right? So we modeled climate change in terms of having some heating in the system that causes people to require more heating in the future, more cooling in the future. Clean water, 50 liters, of which 20 heated per person. Communication, that might be interesting to this group, which is why I'm showing this. So 1 mobile phone per person, 1 laptop per household, with certain data requirements for modeling the service required for this. 1 laptop per household, of course. In COVID time, this doesn't seem like enough. Maybe we need more. Mobility, we're talking about a range of 5,000 to 15,000 kilometers per person per year. And this is depending on a rural split, right? If you live in a city, you might need less. If you live in the countryside, you might need more. Health, we're modeling hospitals by 8 hospital beds per 1,000 persons. And education, we have all 5 to 19-year-olds in school. And all the embodied energy and appliances, infrastructure, etc. And to show you the results really quickly, so we're modeling final energy. The IEA reference scenario would take us to something close to 580 exajoules in 2050. They're beyond 2 degree scenarios, so below 2 degree scenarios would take us to something like 380 exajoules total, whereas our model, which is the decent living energy model, takes us to much less than that. It's around 150 exajoules total in 2050. And basically what this model, which is very optimistic, includes high efficiency technology for everybody. Everybody has access to a sufficient level of energy services, as I just showed you, shows that decent living energy would be achievable for all at 40% of current energy use, never mind future projections, despite population growth by 2050 as well. So hopefully that's an interesting result. And I'm not going to show you the recent results regarding the political economy of car dependency, but I think this is really important. So I really encourage you to try to look into some of the research we did on the political economy of provisioning systems. So maybe a better future is possible, but there are real obstacles because we're facing incumbent industries that are very entrenched with our governance systems. So one of the studies we did was on car dependency, and it really showed how the automobile industry, road infrastructure, land use planning, etc., were all really interlocked with our governance systems and push us into energy intensive futures rather than less energy intensive futures. I just want to say a few words from understanding to action. So I would say that the urgency of the climate situation does not allow for gradual transitions either in research or in reality, but it calls really for radical transformation. These years are so important. I would argue that the popular movements that surround us, including the student strikes, I know they're really big in Belgium, the Sunrise Movement in the US, Extinction Rebellion in the UK and elsewhere, all realize this. And is our research supporting them? And how can we contribute to this research, or how can we contribute and participate and support these popular movements in their demands for radical transformation and really rapid action? And there are multiple ways, but I definitely support the call to action of Charlie Gardner and Claire Worldley here. Scientists must act on our own warnings to humanity. And in this article, they said the scientists who alerted the world to the climate and ecological crisis have a moral duty to join the popular movements demanding political action. I'm part of the scientists who endorse mass civil disobedience to force climate action, so I definitely support civil disobedience. I've taken part in it multiple times. I'm currently facing legal action because of that. And we also published a paper from publications to public actions, which is open. It's open access if you want to have a look at it. The role of universities in facilitating academic advocacy and activism in the climate and ecological emergency. So please do have a look. This gives sort of practical ideas of how universities can become tools of change rather than tools of slowing the things down, which is what they normally feel like. And the other thing I want to pay attention to, draw your attention to, is that environmental protest is being criminalized around the world. So I also was part of this letter where several hundred climate and ecological scientists tried to raise attention to this and to call for this trend to stop. And one of the things we said in this is that it has become abundantly clear that governments don't act on climate without pressure from civil society. So threatening and silencing activists is really a new form of anti-democratic refusal to act on climate. So basically, when our governments are crushing and penalizing climate and environmental activists, what they're doing is they stand with ExxonMobil in the plot I showed you. So they're basically standing with the fossil fuel industry, with the automotive industry, and so on, and refusing to take climate action seriously. So thanks for listening, and I'm looking forward to questions.
Thanks a lot, Julia.
So I just need to figure out, there you are. Should I stop sharing?
You can stop sharing, yes. Thanks a lot for your talk. So really exciting presentation. I'm also really happy following your tweets for a while that you've not been forced to give this presentation from prison. So
that's my only hope about prison, is that it doesn't have Wi-Fi. You know, that way I'll have some peace and quiet.
What?
Can you hear me?
Yes. No, now the echo is gone. Yeah. Now it's good.
No.
It's still bad.
Could you put a headset or something? We have a bit of echo here.
You have echo. Is it better now?
Maybe. Yeah, sounds good. Okay, good now, perfect. Questions from the audience? There are a couple of, yeah, okay, plenty, good.
I think, yeah, we still have the echo, so if you have a headset next to you, that would be really better.
Maybe I just go move away from the speaker.
No, that's echo on our side, on her side. Or if you do not have a proper headset, we can just
we tried the headset yesterday. It was a disaster. So I think we should just go with the questions. I'll mute myself while you ask them.
Okay, yeah, all
Thank
good.
you.
That's perfect.
Okay, first question. Who's asking? Yeah, perfect.
Hi. Thank you for the talk. I just have a quick question. So when you were speaking about rich people, well, I mean, inequality in emissions between rich and poor people, how do you, does this account for every emission, like all the emissions from the industry, from, I don't know, building, transportation of goods? I mean, how is this accounted for?
Yeah, that's a good question. So this method, which is called environmentally extended input-output, that's the beauty of it, is that it counts for all emissions, right? So all the upstream emissions. Now, our study on inequality, what we removed from it is we removed government expenditure and capital investment. So there are sort of two categories where it's a bit hard to decide how to allocate them to households. So we removed those, but otherwise it includes all upstream emissions, yes. Upstream emissions or energy, depending on the study. Different studies look at different ones, but they include everything.
Okay, thank you.
I have a bit of a follow-up question on that. So your 40% metric that was somewhere on one of the last slides, that is for global north countries, right? What would it mean for global south countries?
No, that's for the whole world.
Oh, that's for the whole world. Okay, it's a global thing.
Yeah, we modeled it for the whole world. So we modeled for every single person, country, etc. It's a bottom-up model where we take into account demographic change, climate change, and people's urban and rural split of each country. So we model it for each country in the world, literally.
Is it possible to split that up and get a bit of an understanding to what extent we have to reduce and to what extent Africa has to reduce?
So Africa doesn't have to reduce. Africa has to go
that's
up.
what I thought.
But so Africa does not have to reduce. It has to go up in terms of its overall consumption. But I think one of the things to really understand, and Marta Baltrushevitz, who's one of my PhD students, has done studies on Zambia, Nepal, and Vietnam. And so one of the things to understand about lower income countries like in Africa or Asia is that their level of energy use might not be sufficient to allow escape from poverty and deprivation. The distribution certainly isn't in their favor because there's some mega consumers and then everybody else is even more deprived, right? But that's so distribution is not in their favor, and also technological access. So one of the things that her study showed, which is extraordinary, is that richer income classes use less energy than poorer income classes. In some cases, because they have access to efficient technology and electricity and clean cooking fuels and so on. So, so it's not just, you really have to think about these three things: the overall level, how it's distributed, and how it's transformed into services, which really matters for people's well-being. So that, and in terms of this sufficient level of energy, one of the really funny things about it is that it hardly matters where you are in the world. It's always somewhere between 15 to 20 gigajoules per person, which is probably something like, it's about a tenth of what an average American uses, and it's probably about a sixth of what the average European uses, something on that order. So it's a very large decrease in energy use for sure.
Okay, now we would have to understand how much ICT fits into a sixth of our current energy and material uses. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I really encourage you. First of all, this is the first. We did this. We tried. I think we did a good effort, but this is one study, so I wouldn't necessarily trust it. what we did is we really documented the heck out of it. So if you look at the paper, which is by Joel Millward Hopkins as a first author in Global Environmental Change, in the supplementary information, he just goes through everything, all the assumptions he made to make it as reproducible as possible. And you can see the assumptions he made for ICT requirements, for the upstream energy requirements of those, et cetera. He really made a great deal of effort to try to have some reasonable estimate, but it would be really interesting to see what people think, if, you know, maybe there's a different way of doing it. So I really encourage you to look at into the guts of that.
Okay, sorry for stealing time from the audience. Question from your side? Yeah.
Yes, I have a question on the graph that you showed about the classification of the energy consumption with the wealth. And your basic conclusion was that the rich people use, like transport is a luxury good that is used. Yes, that is a good that uses a lot of energy and that is used by wealthy people. But I guess that it's wealthy defined on a world scale, which is, I guess, so it means that potentially rich people would be poor people of France would be a rich people compared to Africa, and this made me think to the yellow jacket problem. In French, gilet jaune, which is basically what you proposed to tax transport because it's a luxury good that consumes a lot of energy. But actually, when you do that, you penalize poor people in Europe or France, let's say. So I would like to have your opinion on this.
Yeah, so that's a really important question. So I think first to clarify, the thing we measure, the elasticity that says that these categories are consumed disproportionately by rich populations, that's within each country. So that's not just across the world. That's actually within each country. Across the board, transport is over-consumed, disproportionately consumed. That doesn't mean that poor people don't depend on it too. And I completely sympathize with the yellow vests in the context of the austerity policies, et cetera, that this fuel tax was completely unacceptable. But I think one of the things to understand, we don't have time to go into it, is that transport in Europe and around the industrialized world is the category that is driving emissions rises and preventing emissions from coming down. So one of the things to understand is that trends in Europe have been towards more heavier cars, more inefficient cars. So all these giant 4x4 4x4 or SUVs or whatever you want to call them. That trend in Europe and around the world is really driving, is really keeping emissions from going down. And that's a trend that our governments are supporting, because why would you put up with having a more inefficient technology when you got to have a more efficient one? And it's something that's being driven by also by the automotive industry, because they're using this particular type of car as a vehicle for financialization and for income through debt, basically. So the real innovation is in these financial mechanisms where they get people into debt to consume heavier and heavier cars. And this is something that we could easily regulate against. So there's no reason why we couldn't have more investment in public transportation, much more efficient vehicles, move towards electric vehicles. So we shouldn't have heavy electric vehicles. We should go towards lightweight and the smallest possible. But that's not our current trend. And I think that transportation requires a lot more scrutiny, because it is not, in fact, it's in fact going in the wrong direction, becoming more unequal, becoming more inefficient, becoming more polluting, and trapping people in a debt spiral that's going to be like the mortgage spiral in a few years, in my view. So we didn't have time to talk about that, but I think it's super interesting and important. And I think we're at time. Is that correct?
Well, I think we have a few more minutes. It's a coffee break
Okay.
now, and this discussion is super exciting. So I think there's one more question coming up from there.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. I wanted to go back to your definition of well-being that you presented early on during your presentation. And I was wondering, do you think this definition can be extended beyond Europe and can be relevant for populations that don't share similar cultural roots as European countries, for instance?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's a view that very much, in fact, comes from the developing world, if you want to put, or the global south, if you want to put it that way. So some of the main proponents, the main proponent in the modern era of the Aristotle tradition is actually Amartya Sen, who got the Nobel Prize in economics for work kind of related to that. So who's an Indian economist. So he came up with the capabilities framework. I didn't tell you all about capabilities and human needs and how they work or don't work together, but the capabilities framework is something that came from Amartya Sen in India. We also very much use the ideas and also the methods of a Chilean economist called Manfred Max Neef, who sadly passed away last year. But Manfred Max Neef is one of the main theoreticians of the human needs framework, and he developed this framework in his work. He was trying to counter the top-down development of the World Bank, and he was like, we actually need to understand what people really want. We actually need to empower communities to decide what they want for their economy, for their future. And he developed this human needs framework and what he called human scale development. And that was in the Andes and throughout Latin America. So these frameworks are very much, I would say, from the developing world. We've also conducted research using them in Zambia, and it certainly resonates with people there. That nobody said this is an insane, this does not fit with our our daily life. So it is already, I would say, a global something that has a universal or global claim as a research area or as a view of well-being.
All right, thanks a lot. I think we have to give you a bit of a coffee break before the next session starts. Thanks a lot, Julia. One final question from me. Your one laptop per family and your one smartphone per person, how long do they have to last?
I think they probably have a lifetime. So Joel will have documented that. Joel Mildred Hawkins. I think he probably gave them a lifetime of a few years. So each of these appliances has a lifetime of something or other. So it's definitely more than 6 months, right? So it's probably a lifetime of a few years.
Okay.
You know, I would say probably less than 5,
Okay.
but more than 2, something in that range. But I don't remember the exact number.
Okay,
But it'll
that's
be
achievable.
in the documentation.
Good. Thanks
And
a lot,
then
Julia.
he assigned the production embodied energy across the lifetime of the appliance, averaged across the years.
Coffee break. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Julia.
Enjoy. Bye-bye.